Hey guys, Navinata, No Limit Hold'em. In today's video we're going to talk about something as fundamental to the game of No Limit Hold'em as it is possible to talk about. We're going to talk about where the money comes from. How do we win money? Where does the profit come from in No Limit Hold'em? I think it's helpful to think about all of this in terms of EV, and the way that I think it's one way we can conceptualize this is if we take every time our opponent makes a mistake against us and we're in a hand with them, whatever their EV is that they're bleeding off in the form of mistakes, we could take that EV and put it into our EV account. Then every time we make a mistake, we have to give that money back out of our EV account. And this is going to build up, hopefully, as long as we're making less mistakes than our opponents are over the course of time. And eventually, if we play enough hands, put enough volume in, to the point where the variance kind of boils out and all of our stats converge and all of the different various lines and the EV adjusted lines, when they all kind of converge, then at that point, the amount of EV that we have in our EV account can actually be cashed, can be traded for literal dollars. So edges, exploits, GTO, and the fundamental theorem of poker. I've heard, kind of interestingly, pretty good players that have a very good grip on things like balances and imbalances and game theory optimal, exploitative play, polarization, bluff catching, all of this. But nobody talks about the fundamental theorem of poker anymore. It's just sort of like a given that people who know about these more advanced concepts know about the fundamental theorem of poker. But the truth is, a lot of them don't. They've never really thought about it. So understand this. This is super important. If your opponents are not making mistakes against you, you cannot make money. It is impossible. There is no other way to make money. Well, aside from just getting lucky, right? So otherwise you're gambling. If you're not making good decisions and better decisions than your opponents, and by definition, if we're making better decisions than our opponents, we're going to make less mistakes. And in the fundamental theorem of poker way of thinking about EV, the mistakes that are made are the thing that cost us money, in exactly fundamental theorem of poker terms. But doesn't GTO get around this? No, it doesn't. And you could think about it like, yeah, but if I make this play, it's a mistake according to the fundamental theorem of poker, but it's actually probably the right thing to do. Isn't that sometimes the case? Yeah, it can be. It can be the case. Sometimes we make a fundamental theorem of poker mistake on purpose, so to speak, but not unless we can count on our opponents to make bigger mistakes on average in that very hand. Like when we take a set mine, if our opponent tabled pocket aces and raised from under the gun, would we call with pocket sixes? Yeah, if we're deep enough and he doesn't know we have sixes, we can definitely call. But isn't that a mistake in EV? Yes, it is. And whatever amount of EV you bleed off on that street comes right out of your EV savings account and gets shipped over to the person that is gleaning that mistake, the guy with the aces. But then post-flop, when you hit that six every once in a while, and he's putting a lot more money in than pre-flop. He's putting money in on flops, turns, and rivers. On the flop, drawing nearly dead. On the turn, drawing damn near dead. And on the river, literally drawing dead. The EV that you're harvesting in those situations now comes out of his account and goes into your EV account. And it more than makes up for the EV that you bled off pre-flop. But that is all there is to it. There is no other thing. This is it. When we start off, there's just the blinds. And everybody who has a live hand, as long as your hand isn't in the muck yet, you have some equity share of that starting pot. Whatever your equity share is, if you fold it, then your equity share, your EV, your equity, I guess is a better way to think, your equity goes to the players that are still alive in the hand. So if you fold and you shouldn't have, you actually cost yourself money, because people say that that folding is zero EV. That's not really true. If you make a fold when you should not, then you are surrendering more equity than you should have, and you're taking that EV that was rightfully yours, theoretically, and you're giving it to somebody else. That's not zero. That's a mistake, and mistakes cost money. They're the only thing that costs money. And the only way that you can make money is when your opponents make mistakes against you. Now, there are two basic ways to make money pre-flop, if we're just talking about the flop, is you can get called by a hand that doesn't have enough equity, hot and cold equity, to make the call. Or you can get them to fold their equity, in which case you lock up whatever equity that they folded out. That's all there is pre-flop. But that's not enough to know, it's not enough to understand, and it's not enough to think about. If you try to think about every decision in terms of the fundamental theorem of poker, it's not always going to lead you to the right places. We have to also think about how are we going to make mistakes or not post-flop, and how are our opponents going to make mistakes against us or not post-flop. And that's why, as an example, if I have ace-2 offsuit and you have king-queen suited, if I raise pre-flop and you call, or if you raise pre-flop and I call, the ace-2 offsuit sucks up some of that equity, or EV. That ace-2 offsuit has more hot and cold equity than king-queen suited. So some of that EV comes out of the king-queen suited stack and goes into the bank of the player with the ace-2 offsuit. But it's going to be very difficult for the king-queen suited to not more than make up for that post-flop, because ace-2 offsuit is going to very often be in situations where it is very difficult for him to make mistakes, or to not make mistakes, because he's going to make too many folding mistakes when he hits like top pair against a straight flush draw and ends up folding it, or when he, and the opposite won't be true, because when he flops top pair, he's not going to be able to value bet it and get maximum value because he's got a 2 kicker, or he's going to have like a pair of 2s, which isn't going to get him very far. So we have to look at these things the way that they actually add up, and we have a shortcut to that, and it's called poker strategy. Really, game theory optimal is not something new and in addition to, it's not something new and something that we use instead of the fundamental theorem of poker. It's a shortcut. It's a way to think more easily, and it leads to the cases where you're making fewer mistakes than your opponents are making against you. But the mistakes that we're talking about are, in fact, fundamental theorem of poker mistakes. There is no other way, again, to make or lose money. When we go post-flop, we can only have one of 3 edges. We can have range advantage or card edge. We can just go to the flop with the better starting hand. We can have a positional advantage and get to act last on every subsequent street, or we can have a playing skill edge. If we are the more skilled player, what does that mean? Again, by definition, being the more skilled player means that you will make fewer mistakes than your opponent makes. If you're not going to make fewer mistakes than your opponents, then you are not at a playing skill advantage. If they make fewer mistakes than you, then they're better than you. That's what it means to be better. Position, how does this help you? How does this fit into the scheme of making mistakes or not? Well, that's the only thing it does, is it allows you to make better decisions with more information, acting after your opponent has had to make their decisions with less information. And that compounds decision point after decision point. So what does it mean to act with better information? It means that we're going to have the ability to, you could say it lots of ways. Well, we're going to be able to over-realize our equity. Sure, okay, yeah. We're going to be able to take pot control lines. We're going to be able to better watch the pot geometry. It's going to be easier for us to get stacks in when we're ahead, and it's going to be easier for us to not get stacked when we're behind. All of those things are true. But you can boil it down eventually, if you break it down far enough, all it really is, the only thing it really can be, is you will be in position to make less mistakes, fundamental theorem of poker mistakes, than your opponents. That's what position's good for. Your opponents are going to have to split their ranges before you do. If some flop comes out where they're going to want to have a donk leading range and a check calling range and a check folding range. Well, once they hit the check button, you know that they don't have their donk leading range. So now they have split their range, and you can do a better job of hand reading them. Then you get to make your decision after they've already split their range, and it'll happen again on the next street or next decision point, and the next and the next. And that's why deeper play with a higher stack to pot ratio favors the player in position, because you've got more decision points on average over which you can wield this positional advantage. But what that positional advantage is, it's an information advantage. And what the thing that gives you an advantage about having more information is when we have more information, we can make better decisions, and a better decision means it's less likely to be a mistake. The other thing we can have is a post-flop range advantage, and if we have the more appropriate range, that means that the range of hands that we're playing is going to cause us to make fewer mistakes than our opponent, cause them to make more mistakes than us. Same thing, doesn't matter. If we're heads up in a pot, whatever mistakes our opponent makes get shifted into our bank account, our EV account. Whatever mistakes we make on a decision point to decision point basis, this is happening theoretically. Post flop range advantage, having card edge. There's only a few reasons that we play one hand over another. There's 4 major reasons: nut potential, synergy, domination, and showdown value. And all of those things are going to help you to win pots that you otherwise would lose, and exploit, well, okay, we won't go that far, garner, encourage, induce mistakes from your opponents. Like when you have ace-king. Ace-king dominates a lot of hands, and when a hand is dominated, it's going to be very hard for that player to not make mistakes. They're going to have to make a bunch of calling mistakes, right? When they've got king-queen and you have ace-king and the flop comes king-7 deuce rainbow, they're probably going to have to call you, and they shouldn't. If they could see your cards, according to the fundamental theorem of poker, that is a mistake. But they might not be making a mistake against your range. That might be a conversation for another slide. Yeah, where do these advantages come from? So all of the money a player wins in No Limit Hold'em can be traced back to the fundamental theorem of poker when it comes right down to it. Why is position helpful? You make less mistakes. Why is playing skill important? You make less mistakes. Range advantage? Less mistakes. Maybe you can argue how practical it is to think in the terms of the fundamental theory of poker in-game. Sure, that's because we have shortcuts for that. Like thinking in game theory optimal, or thinking in hand framing, or the ace king queen. However you look at it, if it's a good strategy, the reason it's a good strategy is because it's going to induce and avoid more mistakes than your opponents will induce or avoid when they're in a pot against you. There is no other way to make money in poker. We do have shortcuts. But in the long run, the player who makes the least expensive mistakes in total, so that can be the least mistakes, or it can make the, you can, just when you add up the size of the mistakes, and you add up all of them, then altogether, if I'm playing heads up against one player, for instance, over 1 million hands, we take all of these little EV things, these EV transactions, where EV is going from my bank account into his and from his account into mine. At the end of 1 million hands, all we're going to have to do is just take the number of mistakes I made against you and subtract by the number of mistakes you made against me, and whatever is left over is going to be the profit that one of these players has made in the long run, and there is no other thing. We've already talked about this or touched on it. What about GTO? Doesn't that count for anything? Yeah, it doesn't replace the fundamental theorem of poker. It just helps us get closer to making more good decisions in terms of the fundamental theorem of poker over the long run. What else would it be? How else can it work? It's gonna, thinking in terms of GTO or exploitative play, balanced or imbalanced, is going to put us in more positions to make fewer mistakes while inducing more mistakes or allowing more mistakes from our opponent. You can look at it, if you know anything about physics, you can think of game theory optimal as like relativity. And you can think of the fundamental theorem of poker as quantum mechanics. And, or just, one is a microcosmic view, one is a macroscopic view. Exploits, metagame adjustments, you can think of those as trading small mistakes for large mistakes in game theory optimal terms. The same as like calling with pocket sixes against a very strong range that's far ahead of it, hoping to set mine, hit a set, and really harvest bigger mistakes after that. So in a way, speculating is trading small mistakes, hoping for larger mistakes in a hand-to-hand way of thinking, whereas exploiting your opponent by getting away from Nash equilibrium in a way that makes your play technically not good, but is very good against that specific player that you're trying to exploit, is the same thing on a macrocosmic scope. Now we're trading GTO mistakes in order to cash in on more GTO mistakes from our opponent. But if you trace that all the way back down to the level of the game space atom, whatever that or subatom, the fundamental theorem of poker particle of game space, then eventually, if you take any good strategy, any exploitative adjustment, any GTO line, any sharp default line, any good thing that you're doing strategically, everything that you're thinking of in these big broad terms that makes it easier and more efficient to think about, it really, if you follow it all the way down to its root, to its core, to the Planck scale of the game space of No Limit Hold'em, it's all about the fundamental theorem of poker. In case you're not familiar with the fundamental theorem of poker, and I'm surprised how many people are not these days. I mean, used to be that's all it was, right? It was like the people that understood the fundamental theorem of poker and the people that were gambling. And the theory of poker was like, it was maybe not even recommended reading. It might have been kind of, we'll just say it was at least recommended reading. I mean, it was almost necessary. Or somebody had to teach you about the concepts that came out of that book. Now we've gotten away from it. But I want to just tell people, let's not get so far away from it that we forget about it. Because anytime that we're making decisions, anytime we're hoping to make money, we're trying to beat our opponent, we're asking if this is the right play, if that's the right play, if this is the right range, if that's the right range, it all comes back to the fundamental theorem of poker, which is, if I make a decision that I would not make, could I see my opponent's cards? Then my opponent makes money from me. When my opponent makes a decision he would not make if he could see my cards, then I make money off of him. That's the theorem. It's the fundamental theorem of poker, by the way, not theory. I would add a little caveat to that. I think we need to also say it's only strictly true if our opponent was able to also calculate the mathematics perfectly. We really can't just say if my opponent makes a play that he wouldn't make if he could see my cards. That's true, but it's not fundamentally true. So if we're going to call it the fundamental theorem, then let's really nail it down and say anytime my opponent is trying to win, can do the math, could see my cards, would do something different than what he's actually done, then I make money. Some of his EV gets shifted into my account. Anytime I make a mistake based on that same definition, he takes some of my EV out of my account and puts it into his account. That's it. There's nothing else to it. In conclusion, generally try to make plays that your opponents can make mistakes against. The only time that's not the case is if the play that your opponent is not going to make a mistake against, if not making that play would be a big mistake for you, or if you don't think that you're going to garner any mistakes on future streets, taking and dragging the fish into deeper water. Other than that, the fundamental theorem of poker is the truth. Every other poker strategy or concept or strategic concept can only help to the exact degree it helps you avoid making FTOP mistakes while allowing or inducing mistakes from your opponents. There is no other thing to do. Play in position. Play with good default ranges and sharp default lines. Make good adjustments based on your opponent's what? Mistake propensities. And play more appropriate ranges than your opponent's play. So you will make fewer mistakes than your opponents, period. There is no other thing. Until next time, guys, Navanad, good, quote, Luck, end quote, good luck.